Hey everyone, we're going to be reading the recent Jack Smith motion for immunity determinations for Trump's January 6th case. Tonight I'm going to be on WIC TV debating the election, so it should be fun. In the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, United States vs. Donald J. Trump, government's motion for immunity determinations. The defendant asserts that he is immune from prosecution for his criminal scheme to overturn the 2020 presidential election because he claims it entailed official conduct. Not so. Although the defendant was the incumbent president during the charged conspiracies, his scheme was fundamentally a private one, working with a team of private co-conspirators. The defendant acted as a candidate when he pursued multiple criminal means to disrupt, through fraud and deceit, the government function by which votes are collected and counted, a function in which the defendant, as president, had no official role. In Trump v. United States, the Supreme Court held that presidents are immune from prosecution for certain official conduct, including the defendant's use of the Justice Department in furtherance of his scheme, as was alleged in the original indictment, and remanded to this court to determine whether the remaining allegations against the defendant are immunized. The answer to that question is no. This motion provides a comprehensive account of the defendant's private criminal conduct, sets forth the legal framework created by Trump for resolving immunity claims, applies that framework to establish that none of the defendant's charged conduct is immunized because it either was unofficial or any presumptive immunity is rebutted, and requests the relief the government seeks, which is, at bottom, this: the court determined that the defendant must stand trial for his private crimes as would any other citizen. This motion provides the framework for conducting the, quote, necessary fact-bound, unquote, immunity analysis required by the Supreme Court demanded remand order Trump 144S. Yeah. It proceeds in 4 parts. Section 1 provides a detailed statement of the case that the government intends to prove at trial. This includes all conduct alleged in the superseding indictment, as well as other categories of evidence that the government intends to present in its case in chief. This detailed statement reflects the Supreme Court's ruling that presidential immunity contains an evidentiary component which should be addressed at the outset of a proceeding. Section 2 sets forth the legal principles governing claims of presidential immunity. It explains that for each category of conduct that the Supreme Court has not yet addressed, this court should first determine whether it was official or unofficial by analyzing the relevant content, form, and context. To determine whether the defendant was acting in his official capacity instead of, quote, in his capacity as a candidate for re-election, unquote. Blassingame v. Trump, where the defendant was acting, quote, as an office seeker, not office holder, no immunity attaches. For any conduct deemed official, the court should next determine whether the presumption of immunity is rebutted, which requires the government to show that, quote, applying a criminal prohibition to that act would pose, quote, no dangers of intrusion on the authority and functions of the executive branch. Section 3 then applies those principles to the defendant's conduct and establishes that nothing the government intends to present to the jury is protected by presidential immunity. Although the defendant's discussions with Vice President Pence about their, quote, their official responsibilities, unquote, qualify as official, the government rebuts the presumption of immunity. And all the defendant's remaining conduct was unofficial, as content, form, and context show. The defendant was acting in his capacity as a candidate for re-election, not in his official capacity, not his capacity as president. In the alternative, if any of this conduct were deemed official, the government would rebut the presumption of immunity. Finally, Section 4 explains the relief sought by the government and specifies the findings the court should make in a single order. Namely, that the defendant's conduct set forth in Section 1 is not immunized, and that as a result, the defendant must stand trial on the superseding indictment, and the government is not prohibited at trial from using evidence of the conduct described in Section 1. Factual proffer. So do we want to read all 4 sections? I'm not sure about to get through it all. We'll start and we'll see where we go with it. How interesting or how informative it might be for the upcoming conversation. Factual proffer. When the defendant lost the 2020 presidential election, he resorted to crimes to try and stay in office. With private co-conspirators, the defendant launched a series of increasingly desperate plans to overturn the legitimate election result in 7 states that he had lost: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the quote targeted states, unquote. His efforts include lying to state officials in order to induce them to ignore true vote counts, manufacturing fraudulent electoral votes in the targeted states, attempting to enlist Vice President Michael R. Pence in his role as President of the Senate to obstruct Congress's certification of the election by using the defendant's fraudulent electoral votes, and when all else failed, on January 6, 2021, directing an angry crowd of supporters to the United States Capitol to obstruct the congressional certification. The through line of these events was deceit. The defendant and co-conspirators knowingly false claims of election fraud. They used these lies in furtherance of three conspiracies. One, a conspiracy to interfere with the federal government's function, in which the nation collects and counts election results, which is set forth in the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act. 2. A conspiracy to obstruct the official proceeding in which Congress certifies the legitimate results of the presidential election. And 3. A conspiracy against the rights of millions of Americans to vote and have their votes counted. At its core, the defendant's scheme was a private criminal effort. In his capacity as candidate, the defendant used deceit to target every stage of the electoral process, which through the Constitution, the Electoral Count Act, and state laws includes states' notification to the federal government of the selection of their representative electors based on the popular vote in the state. The meeting of those electors to cast their votes consistent with the popular vote, and Congress's counting of the electors' votes at a certification proceeding. As set forth in detail below, the defendant worked with private co-conspirators, including private attorneys, CC 1, 2, 3, 5, and private political operatives, CC 6 and P1. The defendant also relied heavily on private agents such as his campaign employees and volunteers like campaign manager P2, deputy campaign manager P3, and senior campaign advisor P4, and campaign operative P5. In this section, the government sets forth detailed facts supporting the charges against the defendant. Before addressing the next section, why none of this conduct is subject to immunity under the Supreme Court decision in Trump, the conduct set forth below includes the defendant's formation of the conspiracies leading up to and immediately following the 2020 presidential election, certain information regarding his knowledge that there had not been outcome determinative fraud in the election, as he persistently claimed, and his increasingly desperate efforts to use knowingly false claims of election fraud to disrupt the electoral process. The government does not consider any of the following conduct to be subject to immunity for the reasons set forth in Section 3. All right, give me 1 second here. Formation of the conspiracies. Although his multiple conspiracies began after election day in 2020, the defendant laid the groundwork for his crimes well before then. Leading into the election, the defendant's private and campaign advisors, including P6, then a private citizen, and P2, the defendant's campaign manager, informed him that it would be a close contest and it was unlikely to be finalized on election day, in part because of the time needed to process large numbers of mail-in ballots prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic. They also told the defendant that the initial returns on election night might be misleading. That is, that he might take an early lead in the vote count that would diminish as mail-in ballots were counted because his own supporters favored in-person voting, while supporters of his opponent, Joseph R. Biden, favored mail-in ballots. Privately, the defendant told advisors, including P6, campaign personnel, P7, a White House staffer and campaign volunteer, and P8, the vice president's chief of staff, that in such a scenario he would simply declare victory before all the ballots were counted and any winners was projected. Publicly, the defendant began to plant the seeds for that false declaration. In the months leading up to the election, he refused to say whether he would accept the election results, insisted that he could lose the election only because of fraud, falsely claimed that mail-in ballots were inherently fraudulent and asserted that only votes counted by election day were valid. For instance, in an interview on July 19, 2020, when asked if he would accept the results of the election, the defendant said he would, quote, have to see, unquote, and it depends. On July 30, despite having voted by mail himself earlier that year, the defendant suggests that widespread mail-in voting provided cause for delaying the election, tweeting, quote, with universal mail-in voting, not absentee voting, which is good, 2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. It will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote. In an interview on August 2nd, the defendant claimed without any basis that, quote, there is no way you can go through a mail-in vote without massive cheating. At a campaign event in Wisconsin on August 17th, the defendant told his supporters, the only way we're going to lose this election is if it's rigged. Remember that. It's the only way we're going to lose this election, so we have to be very careful. In his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention on August 24th, the defendant said that the only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. On October 27th, during remarks regarding his campaign, the defendant said it would be a very, very proper, very nice if there was a winner declared on November 3rd instead of counting ballots for 2 weeks, which is totally inappropriate, and I don't believe that that's by our laws. I don't believe that, so we'll see what happens. The defendant said this despite, or perhaps because, his private advisors had informed him that it was unlikely that the winner of the election would be declared on November 3rd. By October 2020, P1, a private political advisor who had worked for the defendant's 2016 campaign, began to assist with the defendant's re-election effort. 3 days before the election, P1 described the defendant's plan to a private gathering of supporters. And what Trump's going to do is just declare victory, right? He's going to declare victory. That doesn't mean he's the winner. He's just going to say he's the winner. After explaining that Biden supporters favored voting by mail, P1 further stated, and so they're going to have a natural disadvantage, and Trump's going to take advantage of it. That's our strategy. He's going to declare himself a winner. Immediately following the election day on November 3rd, the defendant did exactly that, as his private and campaign advisors had predicted to him in certain states. The defendant took an early lead on election day that began to erode. At approximately 11:20 p.m., Fox News projected that Biden would prevail in the state of Arizona, and according to campaign advisor P4, he and the defendant were shocked and angry at this development. As election day turned to November 4th, the contest was too close to project a winner, and in discussions about what the defendant should say publicly regarding the election, senior advisors suggested that the defendant should show restraint while counting continued. Two private advisors, however, advocated for a different course. CC1 and CC6 suggested that the defendant would just declare victory. And at about 2:20 a.m., the defendant gave televised remarks to a crowd of his campaign supporters in which he falsely claimed, without evidence or specificity, that there had been fraud in the election and that he had won. Quote, this is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. We did win this election. In the immediate post-election period, the defendant claimed fraud without proof, and his private operatives sought to create chaos rather than seeking clarity. At polling places where states were continuing to tabulate votes, for example, on November 4th, P5, a campaign employee, agent, co-conspirator of the defendant, tried to sow confusion when the ongoing vote count at the TCF Center in Detroit, Michigan, looked unfavorable to the defendant. There, when a colleague at the TCF Center told P5, we think a batch of votes heavily in Biden's favor is right. We think a batch of votes heavily in Biden's favor is right. Responded, quote, find a reason it isn't, unquote. Quote, give me options to file litigation, unquote. And, quote, even if it is sick, unquote. When the colleague suggested that there was about to be unrest reminiscent of the Brooks Brothers riot, a violent effort to stop the vote count in Florida after the 2000 presidential election, P5 responded, make them riot and do it. The defendant's campaign operatives and we're trying to figure out who these P5 people are. P5. This just dropped yesterday, so I'm not sure we're gonna have like detailed stuff on this. Yeah, but do they actually name the? They do. That's great. Oh, okay. No, they still use the. The defendant's campaign and operatives and supporters used similar tactics at other tabulation centers, including in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the defendant sometimes used the resulting confrontations to falsely claim that his election observers were being denied proper access, thus serving as a predicate to the defendant's claim that fraud must have been occurred in the observer's absence. Contrary to the defendant's public claims of victory immediately following election day, his advisors informed him that he would likely lose. On November 7, in a private campaign meeting that included P2, 3, 4, and White House staffer P9, who came to serve as a conduit for information from the campaign to the defendant, campaign staff told the defendant that he had only a slim chance of prevailing in the election, and that any potential success was contingent on the defendant winning all ongoing vote counts or litigation in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Within a week of that assessment, on November 13th, the defendant's campaign conceded its litigation in Arizona, meaning that based on his campaign advisor's previous assessments, the defendant had lost the election. The same day, in an implicit acknowledgement that he had no lawful way to prevail, the defendant sidelined the existing campaign staff responsible for mounting his legal election challenges from P2, 3, and others, who were telling the defendant the truth that he did not want to hear, that he had lost. The defendant turned to CC1, a private attorney, who was willing to falsely claim, that's probably Sidney Powell, who was willing to falsely claim victory and spread knowingly false claims of election fraud. As the defendant placed alternating phone calls to P3 and CC1 throughout November 13, P1 informed CC6, another campaign advisor, of the change, writing, quote, close hold, don't tell anyone Trump just fired P3 and put CC1 in charge, and you are to report to CC1, and when CC6 asked if P2 was gone too, quote unquote, P1 replied that they all report to CC1 and that P1 had, quote, made a recommendation directly that if CC1 was not in charge, this thing is over. Trump is into the end, unquote. The next day, consistent with P1's description, the defendant announced his staff change by writing, I look forward to CC1 spearheading the legal effort to defend our right to free and fair elections. CC1, P10, P11, CC3. Oh no, I think I need to charge my headset. Well, shoot. We'll go a little bit longer, then when it dies again, I'll start charging it. And our truly great team added to other wonderful lawyers and representatives. The defendant knew that his claims of outcome determinative fraud were false following the election day, and throughout the charged conspiracies, the defendant, his co-conspirators, and their agents spread lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won. These lies include dozens of specific claims that there had been substantial fraud in certain states, such as that large numbers of dead, non-resident, non-citizen, or otherwise ineligible voters had cast ballots, or that voting machines had changed votes for the defendant to votes for Biden. And the defendant and co-conspirators continued to make these unsupported, objectively or unreasonable, and ever-changing claims after they had publicly been disproven, or that after advisors had directly informed the defendant that they were untrue. The evidence demonstrates that the defendant knew his fraud claims were false because he continued to make those claims even after his close advisors, acting not in an official capacity but in a private or campaign-related capacity, told him they were not true. These advisors included P9, a White House staffer and campaign conduit, and Pence, the defendant's running mate. P9's relationship with the defendant began before P9 worked for him in the White House. P9 had known P13, the defendant's son-in-law, so Jared Kushner, since P13 was a child and through P13 met P14 and then the defendant. P9 was one of several attorneys who represented the defendant in his first impeachment trial in the Senate in 2019 and in 2020, including presenting argument on the Senate floor on January 27, 2020. P9 began working in the White House as an assistant to the president in August 2020. In October 2020, P9 became interested in learning more about the defendant's campaign, and in early November 2020, after he began interfacing with the campaign staff, P9 consulted the White House with White House counsel to ensure he complied with any applicable laws containing regarding campaign activity. Thereafter, throughout the post-election period, P9 became a conduit of information from the campaign to the defendant over the course of the conspiracies. P9 told the defendant the unvarnished truth about his campaign legal team and claims of fraud that they and the defendant were making. Examples of this include P9 repeatedly gave the defendant his honest assessment that CC1 would not mount successful legal challenges to the election. For instance, when the defendants told P9 that he was going to put CC1 in charge of the campaign's legal efforts, but pay him only if he succeeded, P9 told the defendant he would never have to pay CC1 anything. In response, the defendant laughed and said, "We'll see," unquote. Thereafter, in the Oval Office meetings with the defendant, CC1 and others, in which CC1 made speculative claims, P9 told CC1 in front of the defendant that CC1 would be unable to prove his allegations in a courtroom. In a private conversation, when P9 reiterated to the defendant that CC1 would be unable to prove his false fraud allegations in court, the defendant responded, "The details don't matter." In the post-election period, P9 also took on the role of updating the defendant on a near daily basis of the campaign's unsuccessful effort to support any fraud claims. P9 told the defendant that the campaign was looking into his fraud claims and that it had even hired external experts to do so, but could find no support for them. He told the defendant that if the campaign took these claims to court, they would get slaughtered because the claims were all, quote, bullshit, unquote. P9 was privy in real time to the findings of the two expert consulting firms the campaign retained to investigate fraud claims, CC1 and CC2, and disclosed with defendants their debunkings on all major claims. For example, P9 told the defendant that Georgia's audit disproved claims that C3 had altered votes. In the post-election period, Pence, the defendant's own running mate, who he had directed to assess fraud allegations, told the defendant that he had seen no evidence of outcome-determinative fraud in the election. This is in one of the many conversations the defendant and Pence had as running mates in which they discussed their shared electoral interests. Pence gradually and gently tried to convince the defendant to accept the lawful results of the election, even if that meant they lost. These conversations included a conversation on November 4th in which the defendant asked Pence to, quote, study up, unquote, claims of voter fraud in states that they had won together in 2016 to determine whether they could bring legal challenges as candidates in those states. Pence described the conversations as follows, quote, well, I think it was broadly, it was just look at all of it. Let me know what you think. But he told me that the campaign was going to go to court and make challenges, and then he just said we were going to fight this and take a look at it. Let me know what you think. A call between the defendant and Pence on November 7, the day that media organizations began to project Biden as the winner of the election. Pence tried to encourage the defendant as a friend, reminding him, "You took a dying political party and gave it a new lease on life." A November 11 meeting among the defendant, Pence, campaign staff, and some White House staff, during which Pence asked when most of the lawsuits would be resolved, quote, when does this come to a head, unquote. The campaign staff responded the week after Thanksgiving. A November 12th meeting among the defendant, Pence, campaign staff, and some White House staff, during which Pence recalls, quote, the campaign's lawyers gave a sober and somewhat pessimistic report on the state of election challenges. A private lunch on November 12, in which Pence reiterated a face-saving option for the defendant: don't concede, but recognize process is over. A private lunch on November 16, in which Pence tried to encourage the defendant to accept the results of the election and run again in 2024, to which the defendant responded, I don't know, 2024 is so far off. A November 23 phone call in which the defendant told Pence that the defendant's private attorney, P76, was not optimistic about the election challenges. A December 21 private lunch in which Pence encouraged the defendant not to look at the election as a loss, just an intermission. This was followed later in the day by a private discussion in the Oval Office in which the defendant asked Pence, what do you think we should do? Pence said, after we exhaust every legal process in the courts and Congress, if we still come up short, the defendant should take a bow. Discussions in which Pence appraised the defendant of conversations he had with governors in Arizona and Georgia in the context of election challenges, in which he which Pence called the governors simply to gather information and share it with the president, and in which the governors did not report evidence of fraud in the elections in their states, and explained that they could not take actions to convene their state legislatures. But the defendant disregarded P9 and Pence in the same way that he disregarded dozens of court decisions, and that unanimously rejected his and his allies' legal claim that there had, and that he disregarded officials in the targeted states, including those in his own party, who stated publicly that he had lost and that his specific fraud claims were false. Election officials, for instance, issued press releases and other public statements to combat disinformation that the defendant and allies were spreading. At one point, long after the defendant had begun spreading false fraud claims, P15, a White House staffer traveling with the defendant, overheard him tell family members that, quote, it doesn't matter if you won or lost the election, you still have to fight like hell, unquote. The defendant and his co-conspirators also demonstrated their deliberate disregard for the truth and thus their knowledge of falsity when they repeatedly changed the numbers in their baseless fraud allegations from day to day. At trial, the government will introduce several instances of this pattern in which the defendant and co-conspirators' lies were proved by the fact that they made up figures from whole cloth. One example concerns the defendant and conspirators' claims about non-citizens voters voting in Arizona. The conspirators started with the allegation that 36,000 non-citizens voted in Arizona. 5 days later, it was, quote, beyond credulity that a few 100,000 didn't vote. 3 weeks later, the bare minimum was 40 or 50,000. The reality is about 250,000. Days after that, the assertion was 32,000. Ultimately, the conspirators landed back where they started at 36,000, a false figure they never verified or corroborated. Ultimately, the defendant's steady stream of disinformation in the post-election period culminated in the speech that he gave at a privately funded, privately organized hall rally at the Ellipse on the morning of January 6th, in advance of the official proceedings in which Congress was to certify the election in favor of Biden. In his speech, the defendant repeated the same lies about election fraud in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, that had been publicly or directly debunked. The defendant used these lies to inflame and motivate the large and angry crowd of his supporters to march to the Capitol and disrupt the certification proceedings. The defendant aimed deceit at the targeted states to alter their ascertainment and appointment of electors. Shortly after Election Day, the defendant began to target the electoral process at the state level by attempting to deceive state officials to prevent or overturn the legitimate ascertainment and appointment of Biden's electors. As president, the defendant had no official responsibilities relating to the state's administration of the election or the appointment of their electors, and instead contacted state officials in his capacity as a candidate. Tellingly, the defendant contacted only state officials who were in his political party and were his political supporters, and only in states he had lost. The defendant attempted to use deceit to target the state's electoral process played out in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, as well as across these and other states that used certain voting machines. In addition to the Following evidence of the defendant's conduct during the charged conspiracies at trial, the government will elicit testimony from election officials from the targeted states to establish the objective falsity and often impossibility of the defendant's fraud claims. Notably, although these election officials would have been the best source of information to determine whether there was any merit to specific allegations of election fraud in their states, the defendant never contacted any of them to ask. Here, oh my gosh, this is quite detailed, which I like. One moment here. One, Arizona. The defendant was on notice that there has no evidence of widespread election fraud in Arizona within a week of the election. On November 9, for instance, 2 days after news networks projected that Biden had won, the defendant called Arizona Governor P16 to ask him what was happening at the state level with the presidential vote count in Arizona. At that point, though Fox News had projected Biden had won the state, several other news outlets, including ABC, NBC, CNN, and New York Times, had not yet made a projection. P16 walked the defendant through the margins and the votes remaining to be counted, which were primarily from Pima County, which favored Biden, and Maricopa County, which was split. P16 described the situation to the defendant as, quote, the ninth inning, 2 outs, and the defendant was several runs down. The defendant also raised claims of election fraud, and P16 asked the defendant to send him supporting evidence. Although the defendant said he would, stating, "We're packing it up," he never did. Packaging it up, he never did. Shortly thereafter, on November 13, campaign manager P2 told the defendant directly that a false fraud claim had been circulating, that a substantial number of non-citizens had voted in Arizona, which was false. The same day, as noted previously, campaign attorneys conceded in court that the remaining election lawsuit in Arizona was moot. The defendant in CC1 continued to try to influence P16. That's the governor, right? Yep. Okay. For example, CC1 tried to contact P16 on November 22, the same day the defendant and CC1 reached out to the Arizona Speaker of the House, as described below. And on November 30, the day P16 signed the Arizona Certificate of Ascertainment, formally declaring Joe Biden's electors as the legitimate electors for Arizona, P16 received a call from the defendant and Pence. P16 advised them that Arizona had certified the election. When the defendant brought up fraud claims, P16, eager to see the evidence, and again asked the defendant to provide it, but the defendant never did. Instead, later that evening and into the following morning, the defendant repeatedly publicly attacked P16 as well as Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, P17, on Twitter, retweeting posts by others such as, "Who needs Democrats when you have Republicans like Brian Kemp?" And who was the governor of Arizona at the time? Was it Doug Ducey? Yeah, it was Doug Ducey. I kind of looked at that really quick. Yeah. On Twitter, retweeting posts by others such as who have like that, watching the Arizona hearings, and then watching Governor Ducey sign those papers. Why bother voting for Republicans if what you get is Doug Ducey and Brian Kemp? Brian Kemp, my state ran the most corrupt election in history. Doug Ducey, hold my beer. And why is Doug Ducey still pretending he's a member of the Republican Party after he just certified the fraudulent election results in Arizona that disenfranchised millions of Republicans? The defendants and co-conspirators also attempted to use false fraud claims to convince political allies in Arizona, the Arizona State Legislature, to ignore the popular vote and appoint illegitimate electors. On November 22, the defendant in CC1 called P18 the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives. CC1 did most of the talking. During the call, the defendant in CC1 levied multiple false fraud claims, including of non-citizens, non-residents, and dead voters that affected the defendant's race. When asked P18 to use them as a basis. Oh, actually, Arizona Speaker of the House. We'll pull that up. Quick note here. So, P16, Doug Ducey. P17, Brian Kemp. 18. So is Rusty Bowers. Rusty Bowers refused and asked CC1 to provide evidence supporting his fraud claims. CC1 never did. Indeed, CC1 met with P18 in person approximately a week later and still had nothing to back up his claims. November 30, CC1, P12, and others arrived in Arizona for a hotel hearing and unofficial meeting with Republican legislators, during which they promoted false fraud allegations. In a meeting the day after the hearing, when state legislators pressed CC1 and P12 for evidence to support their claims, CC1 conceded that even on that late date, we don't have the evidence, but we have lots of theories. When the legislators were frustrated that CC1 had no support for his claims and asked him tough questions, CC1 expressed surprise at the way he was being treated, stating, "Man, I thought we were all Republicans. This is a little more of a hostile reception. I'm amazed at the reception I'm getting here." On December 4, P18, that's going to be Rusty Bowers, released a public statement in which he explained that he did not have the authority to use the legislature to reverse the results of the election, and that doing so would constitute an attempt to nullify the people's vote based on unsupported theories of fraud. Bowers made clear that he was disappointed with the legitimate election results because he voted for President Trump and worked hard to re-elect him, but would not violate the law to change the outcome of a certified election. On Twitter, P19, a campaign staffer who worked with CC6, attacked Rusty Bowers for his statement, writing that Bowers is intentionally misleading the people of Arizona to avoid the inevitable. The defendant retweeted P19's false post and praised her. That's gotta be Powell, right? Intentionally. Yeah, we'll probably have to wrap this up soon because I thought this was more or less fully charged, but I guess the headset's not. Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna have to. I'll go a little bit longer, see if I can eke out some more from the battery, just so we can finish up the Arizona section at least. But a month later, just 2 days before January 6th, CC2, another of the defendant's private attorneys and co-conspirators, called P18 and P18's counsel. P20 had encouraged P18's Rusty Bowers. Yeah. Had urged him to overturn the results when P18 told CC2 that there was no evidence of substantial fraud in Arizona and that he could not legally call the legislature into session. CC2 was undeterred. He concluded that he didn't know enough about the facts on the ground regarding fraud in Arizona and had said that P18 should nonetheless falsely claim that he had the authority to convene the legislature and let the courts sort it out. Bowers again refused. In the post-election period, P18 was harassed on several occasions. Individuals gathered outside Rusty Bowers' home with bullhorns and screamed and honked their vehicle horns to create noise. Once an individual in visible possession of a pistol and wearing a t-shirt in support of a militia group came onto Rusty Bowers' property and screamed at him. At the time of these events, Bowers' daughter was at home and very ill, and the noise caused her disruption and angst. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna go ahead and charge this bad boy up. Maybe I'll play a game, StarCraft or something, in a separate stream in between here and when we reconvene.